you're waiting for me. I thought you were speaking. So it's been a long 2 days. First of all, welcome to the technical conference of the New York Public Service Commission. I was thinking about this morning, it's a little bit, when you have a party, it's a big family party, and you have lots of out-of-town guests, and then the guests go home and the family's hanging around having a good time afterwards. This is our good time afterwards. So welcome to the technical conference on REV. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Jonathan Schrag, who at the NYU Law School, Durrani Center for Environmental Law and Land Use Law. Jonathan, it was very much appreciated the work you've done to arrange this venue for us. We really appreciate it. It's a great venue and great to be here. This is our second technical conference. As you're aware, we had a first one on July 10th. Seems like ages ago. And where we focused on some of this very specific issues in terms of what we called more of the technical issues around the infrastructure and things like that. Today, really, our focus is going to be on policy issues. And for me, the primary issues as we see in the comments, and we're certainly very appreciative of everyone's comments on what we're seeing in terms of how we're going to deal with these things as we think about the next level, next generation of utility regulation in the state and retail markets, are sort of like the fundamental things that I think about in terms of markets and gaining market confidence. One is, how do you attract investment? So what structures do we need to put in place, both regulatory and market structures, to attract investment in DER? Because this, as you know, for us, as we look at things, we're looking at how we can find market solutions as opposed to just regulatory solutions and mandates to get us where we want to go. The second is in terms of markets, and that means market confidence, obviously, for investors, consumers, providers, utilities. The second is data and information. I mean, we can't have markets without ubiquitous data and information, and for us, the data and information really falls into two buckets. One is, what kind of information and data do vendors need to have, do particular participants need to have, in order for them to make decisions on where to invest, how to participate, what is the ROI that they need, and are they going to be able to gain it, and where do they place their investments. And the second is customer information. And for customer information really takes on two sides. One is, we all know that if we're going to go out and shop for a car or shop for an airline ticket or shop for a, loaf of bread, there's lots of information out there about the varying choices, and you can make an economic decision on what you want to buy, when you want to buy it, and where you want to buy it. Unfortunately, in the electric sector today, the information still remains rather opaque. And so how do we get information to the consumer so the consumer can make this good economic decisions for them, as well as other choices they might have based on their value system, and also for suppliers. I mean, one of the things that we know is very difficult if a customer wants to make a choice around being able to integrate solar, being able to become a more efficient user. It's very challenging for them to find who are the vendors, what do they have available, how do I comparison shop. And so how do we get that going too? Because to me, those are some of the critical issues of gaining confidence in the market. So a lot of the questions that we're asking the panelists today and your comments have been very helpful about are how do we go from here to there, and how do we start thinking about this market, and what are the critical features that we need to do and get right to gain confidence at all levels. So that's how I would characterize this issue. The way the format's going to work today, we've asked various staff members to be moderators on the panels. We're asking the panelists to summarize in just 2 or 3 minutes, not 5, not 10. We're not looking for long speeches, because we do have your comments, but just to orient us as to your views on these issues. And then we'll have an opportunity for the commissioners to ask questions, and as well as advisory staff. But we have gotten a lot of requests from various participants here to participate, ask questions. So as time allows, because this really, for us, is an opportunity for the Commission to get clarification information on some of the questions that we're grappling with in the REV docket, we will allow various folks to ask questions if they have it, but I'm going to tell you that I've asked Kate Burgess to be the disciplinarian here, or our moderators, and so we're really not looking for statements, because we do have your statements, and we're really not looking for questions to the commissioners. We really want, if you have questions to the panelists, to give you that opportunity, but it will have to be as time allows, because this is more about the commissioners getting information and clarification of some of the comments that have been filed, as opposed to an open forum, which we will have at other times. So with that, again, welcome, and before we get started, I'd like to give my fellow commissioners an opportunity to make opening comments if they would like.
I'll make this really quick. I look forward to today. We have asked a lot of good questions, which was a difficult process to get to the good questions. Now we got to come up with the good answers, which is an even more difficult process. So I look forward to people's input today. We need to know a lot, so we look forward to everything that you're about to tell us. Thank you.
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to see so many people here today. And our staff, I want to thank them all for their hard work under the leadership of our chair, and waiting to hear all the comments by our esteemed panelists here today. So let's just get on with it.
I'm very pleased that we have this opportunity to start really getting into the weeds of the critical policy decisions that the Commission is going to have to make in Phase 1 of this proceeding. I'm very much looking forward to hearing where consensus or partial consensus or semi-consensus can be obtained on some of these big issues, and where the real differences of opinion are that we're going to have to make some decisions on.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here today. To me, the question is there a way to provide improved energy services to the customers? And I think this is what REV is about, is trying to figure out the answers to that. I look at this as a significant opportunity. If we can do better, if we can help grow the economy, if we can have safe and reliable service with the added required benefit of clean energy, then we need to have that conversation. New York is a leader and can continue to be a leader, and I look forward to that. And I do hope that people do mix it up today and be willing to share so that we can get to the better product. What I go by is the proof, as a mother, is the proof will be in the pudding. So I'd like to see the same with that here. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I turn this over to Raj in the first panel, Richard Kaufman, who is the chairman of Energy and Finance for the state, is actually with us today. And I've asked Richard if he'd like to open or provide a few comments on behalf of the administration.
I feel like Phil Donahue walking up to the stage. So thank you all. Thank you, Chairman Ziebelman and members of the Commission. And thanks all of you for being here today, for your comments. All of you make a huge difference in what we are all trying to do, and I want to stress the word all, and stress the words our efforts to change the energy system, because we believe that our energy system is not sustainable. It's getting more and more expensive. We're not getting the economic development benefits that we want, nor we're getting the emissions reductions that we need to have. New Yorkers pay a lot for our electricity. We need to change our course. So I'd like to put very briefly, REV in the context of the governor's energy policy. And put really simply, our energy policy seeks to mobilize markets to build an electricity system that gives customers more choice, value, affordability, and resiliency. We want a system that encourages economic growth and innovation. And we want a system that enables us to achieve meaningful emissions reductions. And so why is the emphasis on markets. Well, markets certainly bring more capital more quickly than government. We need investors to build the system. We need markets to bring innovation, and markets and market participants will find the projects and the opportunities, whether it's to smart home, a neighborhood, or to microgrid, a hospital, and a community. So what's government's role? Government's role here is to enable markets, not to be the market. And so government-funded projects sprinkled around the state is not a market. So how can we enable markets? So quickly, 3 things. We can help markets by achieving scale. Clean energy is the only energy source that gets cheaper the more of it that's made. A state even as big as New York State can't influence hardware costs, but we can influence soft costs, the cost of financing or customer acquisition. And that's what we're doing to help markets scale up. So the Green Bank is a good example. The bank uses ratepayer funds, funds that would have been used to fund one-off projects. We announced the first deals last week before last, using $200 million that will leverage $800 million in projects in energy efficiency and solar across the state by partnering with private sector institutions whose progress is limited by financing gaps in the market. The Green Bank's not a subsidy-paying activity, subsidy-giving activity. Most of the gaps the Green Bank is filling is because market opportunities are too small for traditional capital providers. So once the Green Bank has aggregated projects, banks can take over, just like they do in other sectors of the economy, and the Green Bank can step out of the way. Or we could look at the billion-dollar New York Sun as another example where the goal is to get solar PV on a path to a self-sustaining market without support. So instead of simply providing grants to solar projects, New York Sun has an emphasis on reducing soft costs that represent more than half the cost of a solar installation. So the more and sooner the industry achieves scale, the less support, and the sooner the industry can stand on its own without government subsidy. Or we could talk about the role that the state is using with its own assets. New York Power Authority. So New York Power Authority is working with schools in the K through solar program. And so far, since the announcement a couple months ago, 118 school districts have registered for the K through solar, representing about 750 schools. People want solar in their communities, and we can get further scale by involving communities around the schools. And again, another example of government helping to create scale. Markets mean more competition, which drives innovation and solutions. And so that's another thing we're trying to do, is to drive more competition. So the $40 million New York prize offers communities the chance to compete for funds to help develop a local grid that offers the services that they want. The $4 billion Clean Energy Fund will also be less about funding specific technology-based programs and more about enabling markets to determine the best solution for a problem. And the third area of markets and market focus of policy is to try to create better price signals. And the electricity system is filled with price signals that could work a lot better. And yesterday, I know you spent time on the question of capacity markets and how well they work as price signals. But we can look at other things, like the way the current market structure gives no value to the long-term predictability of renewable energy costs. We need better price signals if we're going to move capital. Which finally brings me to REV. Because REV reflects each of these policy objectives in animating markets. It intends to provide better price signals for DER and better financial incentives for improving system efficiency. It aims to improve markets by enabling and encouraging competition around customer solutions, since This competition will encourage innovation and better solutions for customers. And providing more competition and better price signals will get greater scale, and scale is what's going to lower costs. So I said at the beginning, we pay a lot of money on electricity in the state. Every day, utilities and customers spend money on the system. We can't keep rebuilding the system of the past. We need to start putting dollars to build the system of the future, and that's what our policy, through stimulating markets, aims to do. So the future starts right now. So thank you very much again, and I'll be here all day. I look forward to listening to all the comments.
Thank you, Richard, and it's a great challenge. I think we can meet it. So I'm going to turn this over now to Raj Adapalli, and Raj will be introducing, I think, the panelists, and we'll get going.
May I just interject for 1 second?
Oh, certainly.
I just would like to, for the benefit of the panelists, we have a light system that we're using just in order to make sure that all the panelists have an equal opportunity to address the commission and we can keep the day moving. As the chair said, you each have 3 minutes. There'll be a green light going. You're down to 30 seconds. There'll be a yellow flashing light. And when your time is up, there'll be a red light. So we ask you to please just adhere to that so that everyone has an opportunity.
You don't want to find out what happens
when your
after
time's
that.
up.
I'll move this for you because I know that is in the way there, so I'll move that to you.
Yeah.
Ejections.
I can't see the red.
Good morning. REV has been... Hello? Keep talking.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Yes, you can. Okay. Those in the back can hear. Those in the front, can you hear now? Okay. Okay, let me... further ado, let me introduce the panelists, and I'll offer my comments as we go along during the panel. We have, to my left, immediate left, Carl Rabago with the PACE Energy and Climate Change Center, John Dowling, a former colleague from the PSC, now with the Consumer Power Advocates, and Michael Mager from Multiple Interveners, and then Peter Fuller from NRG Energy, Stuart Nachmius from Con Edison Company, and Peter Reeve from Solar City. We'll start, just for the sake of ease, with Carl and then go down the road 3 minutes each, and then we'll engage in some Q&A.
Your mark, it's set, go. Hi. Thank you very much, Chair, Commissioners, Mr. Kaufman, for having this important proceeding. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the PACE Energy and Climate Center. We've been involved in clean energy and utility matters for about 25 years, which is actually how I got started a long time ago as a student, so it's a real treat to be here on behalf of the organization. I'm also here on behalf of a coalition, a collaborative called the Clean Energy Organizations Collaborative, formed by PACE and the Clean Energy New York, and the Alliance for Clean Energy New York, ACE New York, and basically because we just found it, we hope, effective but definitely efficient to group voices together in order to address these complicated issues. Our goals are primarily, not surprisingly, in pollution reduction and the advancement of clean energy technologies and business opportunities for clean energy technologies, and to improve the flow of information about markets and rate design issues so that our constituent members can participate in a meaningful way. Overall, we have 3 key comments. First, like many, I think like everyone here, we strongly support, we actually don't just say it, we mean it. We strongly support the vision behind REV and what we're trying to accomplish here in New York. not just for what it can do for New York, which is, of course, the first test, but because it's setting an important national example that we think can be borrowed from and maybe even improved upon eventually by other states. Second point is that we believe that we are now at the stage where we really have to start charting this out. We have to work out the details. So I think the major structural ideas are on the table. There's some key decisions to be made about them, but we really do need to start mapping out the market and explain how new incentives will work, where they will be targeted, and how the mechanisms of these markets will work, and other mechanisms, regulatory mechanisms as well, in order to accomplish our results. Then finally, we would say that we need the Commission and all the participants need to be constantly aware of the issues associated with how we could go wrong, as well as what we want to do. When I had the opportunity to participate in the Texas deregulation scene back in the 1990s, I advise our legislature to remember that in the midst of negotiations, sometimes it's critically important to keep your eye on what your original vision was. I'm not sure they did that there well, but I think we need to here. I'm getting the yellow flashing light. I've focused on a number of other things in my written comments. I will highlight we need to get a foundation of cost-benefit analysis. We've been talking about it for years. We need to make it real and internalize it into the process. And the last thing I'll say, in order to stay within my 3 minutes, is perhaps the most important thing we can focus on right now is need identification processes that will reveal the potential values that third parties and utilities can successfully target under a REV environment. So it's the early processes of the old days. Some of us would have called this local integrated resource planning, but it's going to be some version of open processes that clearly and objectively articulate the needs that the market will then respond to. I'll stop there and give room for more discussion.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank the Commission for this opportunity. My name is John Dowling. I'm with Consumer Power Advocates. Consumer Power Advocates, or CPA, is a member organization of hospitals and universities in New York. Our members are among the largest employers in the city. They also operate over 15 megawatts of distributed generators. So we know a little bit about the distributed generator business. As I was asked to participate today, I thought a little bit about market structure, and I tried to think of an example of a new technology that is growing and is transforming the utility industry in some way. And the example that came to mind was solar energy, and particularly residential solar energy. And that's been around a while, and really the technology is improving constantly, but it's been around a while, and I thought, what characteristics have changed to suddenly make that such an important growth industry? And it occurred to me that there's three things. One is there are explicit subsidies based on public policy considerations that make it more economic in marginal cases. The other thing is there's a simple rate plan. There's net metering, which may be controversial in some places, but it's a simple rate plan that the customers understand. And the third thing, and the new thing, is that we now have risk-free financing for solar energy. Now, if we compare that to the other DG initiatives, what we find is we have an incomprehensible standby rate plan that protects the utilities' interests, but is difficult, very difficult for developers to predict or estimate what their energy standby costs will be. It provides no protection at all to customers, and provides almost complete protection to utilities. That led me back to what market structure do we want for DERs? And we were disappointed to see the staff straw proposal that would allow utilities to own DERs, to own generation on a distribution system. We think that kind of conflict, creates a clear conflict of interest between the utilities and energy providers, and we think it will only suppress competition, and it will be done at ratepayers' expense. So, with that, I see my time's up, and I'll pass the microphone to Michael.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Mager. I'm representing Multiple Interveners, which is an association of 60 of the state's largest industrial, commercial, and institutional energy consumers. Multiple Interveners' interests in this case are primarily twofold. There are a number of Multiple Interveners members who have a keen interest in providing distributed energy resources, such as distributed generation and demand response. At the same time, however, Multiple Interveners is comprised of large consumers, and as such, they're very concerned about the costs and the price impacts. Multiple Interveners would like to see this proceeding address and reduce or eliminate barriers to DER. We would like to see this case lead towards accurate economic price signals to customers, but then, thirdly, to let the markets develop without putting a thumb on the scale or relying on customer-funded subsidies. And I think as we continue on with this case, I think one of the primary goals against which every decision should be made is whether what we're doing is benefiting customers or not. And I'll just stop there, and I look forward to addressing the issues as they come up.
Thank you. Can I get his time? Good morning, Chair Zibelman and Commissioners. Thank you very much. Mr. Kaufman, thank you for being here. I want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Pete Fuller. I represent NRG Energy. You may know us as the largest, or at least one of the largest, owners of independent power generation assets across the country, and we're very proud of that work that we've done over the years to maintain the electric grid and provide a viable and economical source of energy across the country. But we are in the midst of, and really have made a major turn in our company to become a customer-centric business. We believe that the future of energy, much like the REV vision that's been laid out here, lies with the customer. Customer engagement and customer empowerment for making their own energy choices. So we are strongly supportive of the vision and enthusiastically interested in how this proceeding plays out. We believe that if we take this approach, and if the Commission takes the approach of customer engagement and empowerment and really driving the innovation that is part of that vision, that really can produce some revolutionary and amazing results, we believe. What we're concerned about, I think has been raised here already, and I'm sure folks have seen it in a number of parties' comments, including ours, is the way the straw proposal is structured now does put the utilities in a central role of ownership of the DERs, and we believe that's got tremendous potential to inhibit the growth and engagement that we think is so important here. And so we believe that the path early on is to create enabling steps for third parties and innovators to come in and introduce solutions, and not to put the utilities in that role early on. The other question we have about the structure of REV here is the sense to which, or the extent to which the distributed system platform, the DSP, would be a controller, a manager of the energy flows and so forth. We don't see it as an ISO-like arrangement where all these distributed resources are waiting for the call. We think a lot of that can be done automatically, and so we're very concerned about over-engineering and infrastructure for the DSP at the outset. So we believe that to begin with here, the focus should be on enabling steps to make it easier for customers and third-party providers to bring their innovation. And seeing that I have the flashing light, I will end here and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
So thank you. Stuart Nachmias. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm representing the Joint Utilities Group, which includes the 4 investor-owned utilities in New York. We support the direction of the REV proceeding and think it's important to address all these many issues. We believe customers should be at the center of everything we do, and we're looking for opportunities for REV to enhance our customers' experience, simplify their energy choices, and provide them with information and tools that they need to manage their energy. We certainly want to facilitate the entry of distributed resources by creating an attractive market. We need all market participants at all levels to be engaged as we consider the market structures that will catalyze those markets. And it's critical, we believe, not to foreclose any options as we seek to evolve the industry and take advantage of new technologies and customer engagement. It's important that we use DERs to achieve public policy and customer objectives, but also support the underlying system and recognize that we're still going to have energy flowing from bulk resources to customers, and if we get it right in the other direction, from customers back to the grid as a means to achieve efficiencies and meet growth-related needs on the system. There are many structures. We'll talk more about that, but it's important for utilities, third parties, and customers to have the ability to participate and for us to work together to engage customers. And we think doing that, demonstration projects are going to be really important because we need to get success stories so that we can help customers really see by example what the benefits could be. With respect to reliability investments, we think DER can play an increasing role in assuring that we have reliability of the system. I know utilities still maintain the obligation to provide safe and reliable service, and so doing so will need more visibility to understand the DER that's out there, how it's operating, and potentially be able to control DER if customers allow us to do so. So utilities will be really just working on new relationships and new ways to incorporate those resources, identify where those resources are needed, and be able to use those resources and rely on them differently in their planning. It's going to be critically important, again, to allow the markets to develop in a way that utilities have that central role. With respect to economic investments, we think that there are certainly areas where customers will make choices to invest in resources because they see value beyond that for reliability. They may desire to have cleaner energy production, or because it meets another aspect of their needs, resiliency, for example, to attract tenants to a building. In our view, subsidies may not be needed for those kinds of investments, but they may do so because they're controlling their energy, or as I said, meeting other objectives. So I guess, just to sum up, we think customers should be able to choose the DER provider and should be provided the opportunity to meet all their needs through the utility or a third party. I guess to quote just from Richard Kaufman, we want to get to scale, and we think we need all hands on deck to be able to get there. So we look forward to working with the Commission and with everybody here today.
Hi, Peter Rive, co-founder and chief technology officer of Solar City. Solar City is currently the nation's largest distributed generation solar provider. We're on track to deploy about 1 gigawatt of incremental new distributed generation solar next year. We are committed to simultaneously lowering the cost of solar in such a way that by the expiration of the investment tax credit in 2017, it is effectively subsidy-free. And we're also dedicated to ensuring that distributed resources, solar as well as bundled battery packs, are an important tool for the distribution system operator. When I think of the kind of benefits that distributed resources can offer and how these should be incorporated into markets, I break them down into three distinct parts: energy, capacity, and reliability. In terms of market requirements for energy, I think the current market of net energy metering is a great kind of market environment. In terms of capacity at this stage, there isn't really a great market for an individual homeowner to participate in a capacity market. And I don't necessarily think that the homeowner will be able to digest capacity markets, but there is a way for third-party organizations like Solar City to essentially provide the capacity benefits to the market. And then also with reliability services, so these are frequency support, voltage management, and so on. I also want to say that, that when our manufacturing plans in Buffalo are fully realized, we believe that our costs will be so low that storage can be incorporated in such a way that we can provide firm capacity resources when storage and solar are combined. Smart inverters can, as of next year, provide reliability services. So at this stage, these are the technical capabilities of distributed solar, and if there was a market, we would be able to provide those services into that market.
Thank you. First of all, thanks all, and probably going to have a few questions, and I was kind of thinking about this last night following our conversation yesterday with FERC, and it occurred to me that one of the challenges that we do have in the regulatory structure we operate in is that the state's public policy and actually the PSC's mandate around ensuring that electricity is reliable, economically efficient, and clean doesn't really track well with the federal FERC mandate, which is only about reliability and economic efficiency. And so when I had that conversation yesterday with those of you who were there, Chairman LaFleur, that really became the rub, is that the markets as designed really don't reflect the full public policy of the state. And now we're starting to think about, well, how do we improve the markets to get that desire and that public policy integrated in, so it's no longer considered an externality, but really an internality of market design. So I was kind of thinking about this, and in reviewing your comments, I'd like to start out with what I think is probably some agreements we can have in a way to thinking about this construct moving forward, to see where we have agreement, where we have disagreement, and maybe some paths forward based on the facts that you're coming at this with very different viewpoints. So with that, I have to start with the fundamentals, that I'm going to ask a series of questions, and if, I'm going to hope that only if you disagree will you tell me you disagree, so that I don't have to go down the line and waste everyone's time. So first is starting with the precept about the role of the distribution utility in the deregulated market that we exist in New York, and the fact that the distribution utility in New York still has the obligation to serve, meaning that they have no choice, but anyone who needs energy, they have an obligation to meet it instantaneously unless there's some specific special arrangement where a consumer has said that they're willing to be absolutely unconnected to the grid. Does anyone want to disagree with that? So, good, so far. Second is... Should we go home now? No, I'm glad. Second is that there is no concomitant obligation on the purchaser, consumer, to buy. And so while we have an obligation to serve, there is no obligation to buy. Everyone agree? No? You think that the consumers have an obligation to buy?
Well, it depends on what they're buying. If they are connected to the grid, they are buying some level of service from the utility. They're paying, even if they use no electricity, they're paying for customer service charge to the utility to pay for their interconnection. But
that's a product, right? I don't want to quibble. I mean, the question is, I guess, is to let me see if they don't have no obligation to buy at a certain volume.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that.
Okay.
I think the meaning of the standard rates is that they have an obligation to fund all the facilities for whatever volume they might possibly need. So I think maybe there's not that obligation to consume energy, but under the standby rates, there's an obligation to fund the facilities that will allow that. So there's a substantial payment they're making to the utility.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I
was going to agree with John. I think utilities, plan the system to meet not only energy but expected demand of customers, and so I think there's an implicit obligation that customers will contribute, to the facilities that are being held for their use.
So, yeah, and I'll just be the geeky law professor and say that as long as the entity enjoys a monopoly status, and the distribution entity does, service is according to tariffs, which are a very unique kind of contract in which they become binding merely by the acceptance and use of the service by the customer, meaning there is no freestanding obligation to purchase any service the utility offers on behalf of the customer, absent their volitional decision to do so, or the entering into a specific contract that adds that term to their service willingly by the customer, such as a standby rate. So I agree with you for very good reasons, but if we're talking about a world in which no entity has a monopoly sort of status, and no leftover entity is offering tariff services, then we're in a free market where everybody contracts their obligations mutually. But until then, it doesn't exist.
And those, I think, are important clarifications, because I think dividing up the fact that if, in fact, a customer is integrated into the system and therefore is asking for essentially the system to stand by for them, there needs to be a transaction fee associated with it. But in terms of the total volume that the customer may buy in terms of energy, there is no concomitant obligation. That could be based on what if they decide to put in tight windows, if they decide to put in a distributed generator. There's no must-take obligation coming from the grid. Is if we divide it up from distribution to energy? Good. The reason why I'm saying that is that then it seems to me then what we're really talking about when we're talking about the REV is the fact is that we're trying to make certain, and this is the conversation we were having yesterday with FERC, is that we're not over-procuring from the wholesale market when, in fact, there's distributed energy resources or ability to shift and manage load to avoid having to purchase from the wholesale market. And what we're talking about in REV is figuring out the series of I guess, rules, regulations, and that will allow us to make certain we're optimizing what's happening behind the meter as almost the first step before we start buying from the wholesale market. But that needs to be linked to make sure there's no over-procurement. Would you guys agree that's a fair statement of where we can go with this?
Let me just try and play back what I think you're getting at. I'm not sure I'm following it completely. Because I think there are, if I break it down, your thought about not over-procuring from the wholesale, I think that I think about it at least in two different buckets. There's the capacity. Are we planning for the aggregated distribution, consumer end-use load? Are we planning for that to be above some level? I mean, and as that goes, there's no commitment either way there, other than that the wholesale market is trying to plan so that, based on forecasts, there will be enough supply around to meet it. So when thinking about that, when you gross up from the end-use level up towards what the wholesale market needs to deliver, I think, in my mind anyway, the way that's going to take care of itself primarily is through the actual activities at the end-use level. When you install distributed solar, CHP, whatever it is, you're going to naturally dampen those peaks, and that will translate into lower requirements over time. So I think that's, in large measure, can be sort of an organic thing. Whether there's a direct link, as I think there is an effort to be today, to say that a specific action at the distribution level will offset some incremental amount of demand, and therefore that gets credit for not buying the capacity. I'm not as clear on that link, and I think that's going to be a tough one jurisdictionally going forward. But I think certainly, as the forecasts take into account actual experience at the distribution and load use level, I think it will take care of itself. The other piece of it is the energy side of it, the instantaneous piece. And again, I think that is very similar to the conversation we just had about at the distribution level. There is no explicit or even really implicit contract there about quantities. the market will, and the system operator will attempt to provide all quantities that are demanded when they're demanded.
So, go ahead.
I want to try just a little bit of a structural response to, I think, what you're saying. I think you could define sort of the old system as assume demand, build supply to suit. We'll give you a rate of return on capital investment because you're building supply to suit. And you use energy efficiency and maybe lately a little bit of DG or under the Federal Power Act, some customer generation as a resource of last resort. That's how we tilted the table. That's how we did the utility system. That's how we electrified the United States. And we want to go in the exact opposite direction. What we want to say is that the distribution entity, this DSP, has got to sort of manage their load to the maximum extent possible using distributed resources as available, and then, maybe not as a last resort, but start tilting it the other way, and then and only then make purchases from a wholesale market that might include some of the environmental penalties, if you will, associated with generation from fossil fuel sources. So we would tilt it in the other direction and put the obligation on the utility to the DSP, the sort of the descendant of the utility, to actually maximize its load management work.
So if I could just add to that and then give you guys, because that's my perception too. I mean, we've built the grid around the idea that load is inelastic and that we need generation to follow load. But if we reverse that and assume that load is dynamic and can be managed so that we get to where we would like to go in REV, which is around a much more efficient system, would that suggest then that what we're really doing is we're saying that once the first thing that this distribution utility or some entity, and that's what would be my next question, needs to do, is make a determination of how much do they need to procure out of the wholesale market, and that could only be after, I would think, they're aware of what could be made available in terms of a load reduction market or demand management market.
I guess I agree with part of it and disagree with part of it.
Well, I would expect you to.
Yes. And the first point is, to me, it's a matter of getting to an efficient use of electricity, not necessarily a lower use. I mean, we want to grow the economy in this state, and if we can do that successfully, electricity consumption will rise. And
I hope that's what I meant, so let's hope that's an agreement.
Okay, so we want to have the most efficient system, and we want to improve load factors. And so when you talk about the DSP's role in terms of how much it goes out to the wholesale market, you don't want it to go out to the wholesale market any more than it has to. But on the other hand, you don't necessarily want to maximize the use of distributed generation, for instance, at the expense of the wholesale market. To me, it's what's more efficient, what's more economic. If it's more economic to use DG, we should be doing that, and we should be sending the right price signals and fixing the standby rates and the interconnection procedures and eliminating the barriers to DG so that all of the economic DG that makes sense can be built and the market sees it and the market responds to it. But you don't want to put the thumb on the scale and say, let's build as much DG as possible so we never have to have baseload generation again, because in many instances we need baseload generation.
Let me just ask you this. I think, I agree with that sort of the sort of fundamental premise. But let me ask you, how do we deal with the fact, and maybe we can ask all of it, that if that's the goal, which I think is the right goal to have, it's economic efficiency as well as system efficiency. How do we deal with the fact that we have an integrated peak across the system, but that may be different than a peak on a particular distribution circuit? So how do we manage against both of those economics to drive system-wide efficiency?
So I think structurally, right, we sort of have two things that I think we're mixing up.
Yeah.
So I think there's the economic efficiency of dispatch, and that's where the DSP is going to have to work closely with the NISO. And so we want to make sure that the capacity and energy value between the wholesale market and the retail resources, these new DER resources, how they match up, and that's sort of the economic investment proposition. So I think everybody should have opportunity to participate in the wholesale markets and gain those values. The separate structure that we're adding to that is in the management of the networks, of the distribution system. And so we want to add to that where there is value to the resources in increasing the efficiency of the system, reducing the peak in networks, and have added value. So in some networks there's value to certain types of resources and maybe not other resources. And it depends on where that network is relative to its maximum capability. The closer it is to the maximum capability, the more value it'll have, particularly on those peak days. And so I think we have sort of structurally two buckets of values, one more consistent with the wholesale market and one really disaggregated into networks to really demonstrate and the values that are being brought to bear.
I think there's further people going to respond. Go ahead.
So in answer to your, or at least in response to your first statement about potentially over-procuring from the wholesale market, I think I agree with that statement. I just also want to emphasize that we should not only think about the energy but also the equipment purchases, and not just the energy. Because in the case of distributed resources, you can actually avoid additional equipment purchases if you anticipate it correctly.
You mean T&D type purchases?
Exactly, yeah. And then in response to your question about local versus system, I think that a market in which you have geographically specific capacity and reliability services markets may take care of that problem.
And I was going to say something similar. I think the key is getting the price signals right, and I think that's first and foremost. But let's say that there's local issues that are not statewide and are inconsistent with the typical state peak. And let's say that a certain part of a utility system is being constrained. The way multiple interveners would like to see it work is that that need be transparent to the market. It be identified that an investment is going to have to be made in this part of the system, and then have there be some type of competitive procurement process. Is upgrading the transmission system the best solution, or is maybe a targeted demand response program in that region the best way to handle that, or perhaps distributed generation? And if you send the right price signals, I think the market will respond and the most economically efficient solution will be identified. We don't want to see is kind of the thumb on the scale to dictate a specific solution. We would like to see the market develop. And I guess I don't want to get too much astray, but I want to agree with some of my colleagues that in terms of distributed generation, there are a lot of entities that have the ability to build those projects, and we don't see any particularly or compelling need for the utilities to own these projects.
Let me just follow up on that and ask the question, because that is one of the I guess the issues that we're dealing with. One of the things that staff identified in the white paper is that as we move towards a more integrated grid, where we start to use distributed energy resources, not just as a way for a consumer to reduce their consumption off the system, but actually to help support the grid itself, they will become a reliability resource. And I'm going to guess that you will agree with the right type of transactive model then. The issue is, can we create a transactive model so that if the distribution utility is relying on that resource, then in fact that there's the appropriate level of penalties, etc., if the resource fails to perform and it's getting a payment stream for reliability, not just independent firm economics.
I think
and I'll let Stu answer first, because I'm thinking maybe a little different, but I'm interested to hear the rest.
I think generally we agree with what you're saying, except I think the details are really going to matter here. So, for example, the attributes of the specific distributed resources are going to make a big difference, and it has to be an attribute that's valued for that network. So what do I mean by that? So the example we have in Con Edison territory is this Brooklyn-Queens program, and that has a peak load. It's a local network that has a need, and the peak load stretches into the evening. In fact, we have many networks where the peak load is at night. So there are certain resources that are not going to be valued. So it's not just economic efficient, it's economic efficient within the constraint of what is the attribute that is needed in order to be valued. And so we really need to, and that's where I think the utility has a specific knowledge in how to manage the system. And to the extent that we, incorporate that in the planning, it's going to be important to have the experience, the data, the information to incorporate it. But without the control, it's going to be based on, learning customer experience and customer response and how to incorporate that, which is, very different. Right now we really have much more of a command and control kind of system, right, where we tell a unit to dispatch, it dispatches, and we serve load. This is going to be more probabilistic kind of approach.
If I just build on that and say that's exactly why in my opening comments I emphasized the need for a transparent, open, objective need identification process, because I don't want it to come out of a black box that the DSP says, hey, I need 100 megawatts of capacity right now. We need to know what the shape of that is in advance, early, so people can tailor to it. But I'll also add, and I don't want to derail this part of the conversation, so I'll just put it on as a sort of a recognition later, because we talked about the thumb of the scales. The scale is all thumbs right now, so I don't think we should kid ourselves. There is going to be an important and vital role for performance standards, and performance standards can, inevitably will, and should be added in these transition stages to move the market in the direction that we want it. And that is I do believe it's the jurisdictional prerogative of the Retail Regulatory Authority to incorporate the broad range of concerns. We, of course, stand for sort of those environmental ones, but there are others as well. And we need to be deliberate and sort of open about, the thumb.
Okay. If I could, I want to make sure, put a little more context around here and calibrate things a little bit. In getting to your question, Madam Chair, we look at the DER opportunity first and foremost as a customer-centered, customer value proposition, where customers will be looking for either lower or controlled energy costs, reliability, resiliency. So we look at that as sort of an inward-looking, if you will, customer-based value proposition. And we think there's a tremendous opportunity for that out here. Where I think a lot of the conversation falls almost naturally is more what I think you're referring to, and what a lot of this has been, which is Con Ed or the utility identifies a need, creates perhaps a reliability structure around that. And to your very question, I think in those instances, whether it's a tariff-based product or a contract-based arrangement, we do think there's a place and a need for appropriate provisions. What exactly is the customer committing to provide in exchange for that payment, or the third-party aggregator, and how is that enforced? We absolutely believe that. Whereas in the former, what we think of as sort of the economic customer-centric, that's a different animal. It may have reliability benefits, but it may very well not be a direct quid pro quo of a commitment to operate any certain way in response to a utility or a DSP signal.
I largely agree with that. I think if we're looking at alternatives to a transmission or distribution system investment, and a demand response program or distributed generation is going to be compensated, they only should be compensated for the performance, for obviating the need or delaying the need for that infrastructure investment. So I think linking the compensation to performance is perfectly appropriate. And I also think under certain circumstances, penalties might also be appropriate as well if you fail to perform. I think they have to be structured in a rational basis. I mean, if a DG unit experiences an outage, an isolated outage, they should not be penalized, just like a utility is not penalized for a transmission line outage. So I think you have to make sense when you get into the penalty arena, but certainly compensation should be for performance.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I would say that I'm generally in support of penalties for the inability to meet capacity requirements, but they should be contemplated in aggregate with distributed resources, meaning that if an individual capacity of 2 kilowatts is not available, but the aggregate capacity of 100 megawatts is, then there should not be a penalty, if that makes sense.
So
Because
it should be looked at as a portfolio?
exactly, provided by a third party, right? So Solar City, as an example, may say, I have 100 megawatts of capacity. I may actually have 120 megawatts of customers who are participating. But for whatever reason, at a specific demand response event, 20% of them aren't available, then it would be okay, because I've committed to 100 megawatts at that penalty.
And by the way, that's not new, right? I mean, that's how the demand response programs are run today through the NISO. So that's something that third parties or if it were utilities, anybody who had those kinds of assets, I think would make sense.
Yeah, so if I can just like sum up, and then I'm going to turn the mic over for the other commissioners. If I'm sort of looking at this and listening to what both you testified and what folks said today, if we start with the proposition that we address the issue of DER ownership relative to the role of the distribution utility, and as you know, I was suggesting, look at it as a transactive model, and we address the idea of data and information and integrated planning so that everyone has the same information. And we address the concept of access charges. From that perspective then, in terms of the model of the DSP and the role of the distribution utility, would some of your concerns about the role of the distribution utility as the DSP, for those who voiced concerns, be allayed? And we had the right outcomes in terms of metrics, performance, things like that. In other words, we were perfect. Would your concerns be allayed?
If we get the right outcomes, we'll be happy, yes.
Well, I'll just quickly say, and because I know that other people have stronger views on this, I think that you're still definitely going to have some protection against abuse of market power if you leave the incumbent to take this new role. What I think the challenge is now is that thinking about how the protective mechanisms against that abuse of power can also serve your list of sort of prerequisites for a good market. So that they encourage the transparency, they encourage the objective, release of the data that everybody can play against, and eliminate those sort of black box behaviors. So try to make those protections serve dual purposes, both to facilitate the market and prevent that abuse. And that should nudge the incumbent into the new role that we expect them to play.
Yeah, we think the key thing for one of the key things for the DSP providers is to provide information to the market about what's needed and what the opportunities are. We're aware, or we believe, that there's the possibility of market power abuse by utilities in that role, but we think it's manageable. We don't believe that market power abuse by utilities acting as DER owners, we don't believe that kind of market power is really a manageable problem. The asymmetrical information problem is just too great there.
I'll just go down the line, and then I'm going to turn my mic over in case if anyone else wants to respond.
I share John's concerns about utilities owning DER, particularly distributed generation. I think one of the things that's evident from the service list in this case is that there's ample interest on the part of third parties to provide DER. And I think the drawbacks and dangers of market power in terms of having the utilities own DER outweigh the benefits of merely having them as one extra possible provider. I do not oppose having the utilities act as DSPs. I mean, I think we do have some concerns, but I think they're best situated to do it. I think to get an independent party up and running would add many more years to the commencement of this process. And so in order to conserve costs, avoid duplication, we're comfortable with the utilities acting as DSPs. And I think it was one of the staff documents said maybe it should be on an initial basis, and if we somewhere down the line it may make sense to revisit that, but at least initially we don't oppose utilities acting as DSPs.
So Michael, I just want to follow up. I had one question about your comments that I wasn't quite sure I followed, so maybe you can clarify it. You made a comment about the fact that while you have no problem with utility affiliates providing DER as a non-regulated function, you wouldn't want them to do it in your territory, in the particular utility territory, and I think, Peter, you said the same thing. But from a consumer perspective, putting on your consumer hat, I know a lot of your constituent members work with their local utilities. And if they chose to work with an affiliate, would you want the commission, or would they want the commission to say, no, we're going to tell you who you can work with and who you can't?
Yeah, I guess it's looking at it from the consumer perspective. I'd say, what's the best for the market? What's going to generate the most competition in the marketplace for DERs? And so, do we have a concern about unregulated affiliates owning DER in the utility service territory? I think we do. I mean, I think we can have safeguards and we can police it. But when a utility might be, conducting a solicitation and deciding who gets to own, who they're going to contract with on a transactional basis for the provision of DER, do we want them contracting with their affiliate? And what kind of impression does that leave the rest of the marketplace? Does that impede other people entering into the market either because of real or perceived conflicts?
So I don't want to quibble. I'm just going to try to break it down in two hypotheticals. One is, one of your clients is an industrial plant, and they do a solicitation, not the utility, for distributed generation, and one of the utility affiliates who's in this business responds to that solicitation.
Yeah,
would you say in that instance that you would want that, if that's the best choice, you'd want to prevent that for the consumer?
No, no, and I think it's a really good hypothetical that I honestly did not think of when we were drafting our comment. We were looking at it as the utility as DSP contracting with its affiliate.
As opposed to a consumer contracting for itself.
Right, if a consumer is contracting for itself, there is no market power issue, either real or implied, because the utility and its affiliate are not linked in any way to the transaction. The customer is dealing directly with the affiliate. Okay. So I think that's a really good example.
If I could pick up on that hypothetical, I guess there's a potential that could be the case, and I think there may be value in thinking about that from a customer-driven solicitation as opposed to a DSP or otherwise. On the other hand, I think it still creates some murkiness and some gray area where it's not clear to me that unregulated affiliate of the local utility would have any particular business advantage over anybody else who might show up. So for the sake of confidence in the market and structural integrity, it may be a lot cleaner to simply create the kind of limitations that I think MI and we and others have talked about.
But Reliant does participate in the Texas market.
Yes.
But and that, I mean, obviously that you have that brand identity that you bought, and you're participating in the market.
And in Texas, every customer is out in the market. Right. There are no incumbent utilities providing that service. Right. So it is a different animal. Kind of lost the thread of where we started on this one, so I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I'll let finish, and then I'm going to sit back.
I just address the two issues I think that are on the table. One is the role of the DSP, and we absolutely agree and support that the utilities should be the DSP. We understand there's a need for transparent information, and we want to be able to work and provide that information to all market participants and third parties. We need to do that obviously with cybersecurity in mind and what is the information we're providing. We also need to recognize that not everything that utility does is going to be subject to bid and to that kind of process. I mean, running a distribution system and providing safe and reliable service will require investments, continued investments in the grid, and we will need to continue to do that as we operate the grid. So we need to understand those issues. I think with respect to DER ownership, we hear a lot about market power concerns, but I think we have to understand the reality is that we have 0% market share now. And so we have concerns about folks saying that utilities should not participate and not be able to provide customers with the service that customers want. So we want to be able to provide customers with options We certainly understand that there could be concerns, but frankly, we think that having utilities in the market and working with customers, being able to share the stories of how they were able to benefit from DER resources, which will help grow the market, is really what animating and reaching scale is about. And we think prohibiting utilities from having that role up front is just not really in the best interest of customers and in animating the markets. So we think we need to really consider where everybody's coming from, recognize that utilities often work with third parties, and understand that we all want to be able to get to the point where we have a more animated market with customers making investments, perhaps bringing their own capital to the game, making economic investments in distributed resources, and making the system evolve for the good of all.
I just have a comment on connection charges, and then that is that if you have excessively high connection charges with low variable consumption charges, that will suppress innovation as well as encourage excess consumption. So as an alternative, we can get what we need instead by having a minimum payment, having the customer always responsible for a minimum payment.
So more or less a network charge of other things being variable?
I actually encourage everything being variable, but making sure that the minimum payment still does more than cover their cost of service.
Can I just follow up on the market power question?
Would you mind holding off, and I'll let the other...
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up what Stu said. There's at least 3 sets of economics that go into this along the way. There's the customer economics, which I could argue that people like Solar City are doing a fine job of getting out into the market, and if there's an economic opportunity or an opportunity of identifying that opportunity, I'm not sure we necessarily need the local distribution company to play that role. And the second set of economics is the short-term economics. That's the comparative analysis of distributed resources versus wholesale market prices on a daily basis, on a 6-second basis. That somebody needs to do. Somebody needs to determine what the cheapest set of resources are to operate the system that day. Maybe that's the local distribution company. Maybe it could be an independent entity that does that. And the third is the long-term economics. That is infrastructure. The Queens Project is a great example of where we're looking at the comparative economics of putting in the traditional more equipment to using alternative demand response programs and finding out that we could defer costs. And it seems that almost requires the local distribution company, because they're the only ones that can truly know their system to the extent that doesn't mean they have to be the direct investor. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on, it seems like a lot of people are saying keep the local distribution company out or put the local distribution company in charge, and it seems like there's a lot of gradations that we need to consider along the way. Just wanted to get your thoughts.
Well, in terms of the dissemination of information, I think there are ample opportunities for other parties to provide that, and I think it's already happening. And I think having an open marketplace with the utilities' role defined carefully will encourage more outside participation rather than less. In terms of who dispatches what units on a short-term basis, yeah, I think in many instances it may be the utility that's deciding, is it better to go into the market or use a distributed energy resource on a real-time basis. But to me, that example is another reason why you don't want the utility owning that distributed energy resource, because it could send a perverse incentive for them to use their own resource or that of their affiliate instead of what may be the most economically efficient decision. And whether they would or not, I don't think is particularly relevant. I'd like to think that they wouldn't, but the perception is real. And so I think by limiting their role away from ownership, you totally eliminate that question whatsoever, that their sole function is on operating the system most efficiently. And so, and then in terms of, the infrastructure avoidance, I think, again, if they make the the need transparent, and we send the right price signals that we're looking for, a project in this region of our system. It could be demand response, it could be it could be distributed generation, or maybe even traditional generation, or transmission. Send the right price signals, let the market respond. See what comes. And if nothing comes that's more economic than the utilities transmission upgrade, let them do the upgrade. But I don't think they need to own all of the different choices. Let them own the transmission, the transmission upgrade. It's their system, but in terms of the DER, open that up to others.
But does that provide them a perverse incentive to do the transmission upgrade, which they can get a return on, versus contracting out, which they may not be able to get a return on?
They might, but they also have regulators who can charge them with imprudence if they make inappropriate decisions.
Really?
Yes. So it is in the toolbox. It may have some cobwebs on it at times, but it can come out of the toolbox when uneconomic decisions are being made. And so I think that should be enough. But it will take, in this world, it will take the commission and its staff, kind of doing certain activities that maybe it hasn't had to do that frequently in the past. I mean, in the past, you would look at a major generation project, and it goes, way over budget, and then some people would talk about imprudence and do we need to look at this. And now there's a lot more decisions being made. And I'm not saying that, this should be some, threat or used, inappropriately or excessively, but that's the mechanism, I think, to keep the decision honest.
If I can follow up, though, with because, one assumes a somewhat stagnant market in terms of you identify a need and that's always the same. The other is, in fact, is that the system is a little bit more fluid than that. So we may have a situation where the utility hasn't identified a particular need, so it hasn't gone up and done an RFP, but on an hourly basis, it could use those resources. So wouldn't we want the distribution utility incented to use those resources, as opposed to simply saying, we're going to just take a picture, a snapshot, and assume that we know what resources are going to drive efficiency on the grid?
I think that's right, and I just want to. I think Gary laid out sort of a spectrum of choices, right? So one is sort of this sort of planning piece, right, and sort of the longer term where we sort of know things are happening on a forward basis, and I think for that, there's certainly opportunity to consider other choices. It's not only economics, there's certainly the public policy objectives that need to be factored in there. And I think we can come up with ways where utilities are indifferent, right, and being able to, for example, put some of those payments in a revenue requirement is one way to do that. You back up and you get to sort of the dispatch of the system, and I think there's a dispatch based on sort of the network needs, right? And I think that's what you're getting to, and I think there's a role there that is beyond the planning piece, which I consider sort of the longer-term capacity kind of value, but the day-to-day energy value. And so that could change, and there could be value, and we need to be able to do that. You back up further up the stream, you get the dispatch for the bulk system needs, and that's where I think there has to be coordination with the NISO, and where we sort of bring those pieces together. And then wrapping all of that together, I think, is how do we bring these to customers or not? And I think there's a variety of distributed resources. There's certainly the resources that some of them will be connected directly to the distribution grid, maybe batteries or other technologies that will facilitate, for example, solar, and help integrate. And some of those are choices that customers will have, and I think we need third parties to be very involved. We think we need Solar City to be involved and be working with customers, but we know there are customers that are going to sit on the sidelines but for the utility, and we think that we should have the option for the utility to sort of be there too. But just to recap, I think we need those from the market side. We need those three pieces. We need sort of the planning piece. We need the dispatch for the network's value piece, and we need the dispatch with coordination with the NISO for the value on the bulk system.
And I think if I could play that same structure back here, I think that's very helpful. We again see a lot of the focus here as in that I think what you laid out first, the customer economics, and they're going to operate, whether it's a rooftop solar or a CHP or whatever it is, or, they're going to operate that based on their own value proposition, their own economics as they see it. The second point that you bring out, the sort of short-term dispatch, and I think Stu appropriately broke that down, but I think we see that kind of coming together, and Mike made the comment earlier about price signals, is, at the customer level or that third-party aggregator provider level, you need to be able to see what the wholesale market is doing, because that's going to be a very key component of an economic driver, and when it makes sense to either ramp up production if you have it available or cut back your consumption if you can. Those kind of price signals getting through to that customer level, or at least the aggregator level, I think are going to be key. Whether there's a role directly in that for the DSP, I'm less clear, or it's just a conduit of some kind. The other part that Stu layered on, which I think is valuable, is to the extent that the DSP has particular localized needs that the wholesale system doesn't see, I think a structure that recognizes that dynamic value could be very useful. And to my mind, there's nothing really there at this point for that on a very short-term basis. A little bit longer term, you look at something like the Con Ed folks are doing with the DLRP, sort of a tariff-based price out there, says if you work in this particular area, there's value and you can access these payment streams. I think that's very helpful. And how long that lasts, to what extent people respond to it, I think that's very much up in the air. But I think that's a sort of an intermediate time frame, but that kind of a tariff-based price signal is extremely helpful to augment customer economics or otherwise. And then you get into maybe the bigger things like the Brooklyn-Queens project or something where, again, I think a lot of people intuitively, go there because it makes a lot of sense. Oh, we've got to build a new substation. How do we avoid or defer that cost? I think that's an important element, but I don't see that as sort of the main focus here. We want to start from the customer end and work out. But I think your breakdown, Gary, is very good, and I think facilitating that sort of middle ground in terms of getting price signals from the wholesale market, perhaps augmented with local value, as well as that intermediate planning term of where are microgrids and DERs most valuable to the grid. Those kind of things I think are particularly useful in this context.
I think we just have to be careful where we start, because I'm not sure where the right place is, but the bidding piece, right? So the dispatch in networks, we have to make sure that we have a competitive market for that to happen, right? So you need enough DG, right? Because if you're talking about a particular network or even a particular circuit within a network, you may not have enough suppliers to really allow competitive bidding, right? There really could be market power by somebody that has a resource. So we really need to be careful. It might be easier to start with more of the planning, and as you get more robust participation, you can have bidding. Maybe until then, it has to be more tariff-based value, because we just have to be cognizant of the competition and the competition for resource bidding.
Can I just pick that up, and maybe it's a conversation Stu and I should have offline, but I think it may be helpful. I think what Stu's talking about there implies, or maybe clearly suggests, a clearing function, if you will, at the DSP level, with taking in bids and offers from suppliers and figuring out maybe a price and so forth. I'm not sure we see that as being a particularly useful way to approach it. If there are prices coming from the wholesale level, perhaps augmented with a value, and I think it probably is more useful that way, putting out an additional value for the distribution, then we think that's a way that the customers or the aggregators could simply respond to, as opposed to offering the way we do in the ISO markets. And we also, it may also be the case that it may not really be price. It may be that they can say that, if this network gets loaded to 95% of its capability, and we've got an ammeter out there that shows us that, then it becomes helpful and valuable for people to respond. Maybe that kind of signal can be built into how the DERs are operated. So we're not sure we see that sort of centralized bidding platform on the distribution level.
So Peter, if I could just follow up on that question. on the idea that we don't have distribution-level auction markets, rather just tariffs that sort of identify a priori the value of a KW or a reduction. Thinking in terms of, let's say, which we can talk about today, even though we couldn't talk about tomorrow, let's say 745 does get smashed, and the only DR markets are at the distribution level, so it does become a load moderator. Would that change your view in terms of, let's say, because one of the things I know, right, is that if you're really trying to look at a price moderation at the wholesale level, 1 kW is not going to do anything. But if you can aggregate it up, and suddenly, at Con Ed's perspective, you're talking about dropping 100 kW off at the grid, at least from what the ISO is looking at, then you can really start moderating prices. And so so in that context, would you see this as an opportunity where the ability to manage load becomes a load moderator so that you're not procuring in the wholesale market, and it becomes a way of reducing price if we don't have a DR market?
Well, I think you're actually opening perhaps a much longer conversation about price moderation. We look at it again.
Well, I'm talking about a post-745.
But we look at it from a customer-centric point of view in saying that the benefits of moderation, if you will, go to those who participate and reduce their consumption, not necessarily those who don't participate. If you continue to consume, you're exposed to whatever the market gives you. And if those prices are moderated by somebody else cutting back, so be it, but we don't see that as necessarily a goal. So I think the structure that we envision is really that even in a post-745 world, the idea is really more, the term that I've used and has been bandied about a lot, is price-responsive demand. We will reduce demand when prices get to a point where we no longer want to consume, as opposed to the sort of the planning piece that currently exists, where a lot of that stuff is counted on by the ISO as a capacity resource. And back to my earlier comment, that then organically feeds into the amount of capacity that's needed, because when prices get high, people cut back, the peaks go down proportionally, and that gets built into expectations going forward.
I'd like to jump in on that, and so let's shift gears away from distributed generation and focus on demand response for a few minutes.
If I could just, I'm using distributed generation D, all the same. It's all about reducing load at the meter. I don't care how you get there.
Okay, well, I think from multiple interveners' perspective, there's significant untapped potential for demand response in particular. That a number of our members participate in the NISO's programs. They're very kind of rigid, one-size-fits-all programs, and there's a number of MI members, for instance, who could curtail in the hundreds of megawatts on very short notice, but only do so for 2 hours as opposed to 4 or 6 hours. And so I think having greater flexibility at the retail level in demand response has the potential for significant economic as well as environmental benefits. The way I see it is I think there's multiple different types of programs. I think there's a reliability program kind of similar to the special case resource program that's done now. You could do something in ancillary services. I think there's one for investment avoidance, kind of focused on a specific region of a distribution system. But then there's also the potential for an economic program where there are incentives to reduce load in order to lower the price on a zonal basis or a regional basis, and I think that there's significant potential. To me, I think that's consistent with the wholesale markets. If it's a real market, there should be supply and demand, and so to the extent that demand is organized and aggregated, and I think this is a case where, unlike distributed generation where I have problems with utilities owning it, I do see a role for the utilities in terms of administering retail demand response programs. And I think an economic program should be on the plate for further consideration.
I'll just add, I think I agree that there are these primary purposes, and this is where Commissioner Brown's sort of three buckets start blending together, unfortunately, right? Primarily the purpose might be, and primarily a secondary purpose might be, and we're going to have to look at level of emphasis. This is a bit of what our comments were trying to go to in thinking about separating revenue streams. Maybe what you do is, and this also could end up in rates, right, in terms of charges for current systems versus future infrastructure that needed. Perhaps today to just bring it up to par, and then in the future to accommodate more sophisticated demand response or DER resources of all kinds. I think I'll offer that perhaps another way of modeling after this is thinking about something like a congested feeder. And what's the DSP supposed to do? In the short term, demand response might work, and we can send a real high price signal that would induce some behavior. As over the midterm, we might want to install a lot of solar, especially if that demand response is nicely coincident or follows solar output, because you get distribution benefits in terms of pre-cooling and things like that. Then as we modify toward the long term, we're adding maybe storage and then getting into permanent energy efficiency improvements in the built environment that's contributing to that load. Now, what's ironic about that is some of those those things at the end that permanently avoid the need for the hardware response, which the DSP ultimately has to keep in its back pocket, is some of the least cost resource, right? In other words, doing energy efficiency improvements to those buildings is what you would do to permanently or at least significantly defer the capital investment that is otherwise necessary to defer that investment. And that's the challenge, is how do you get that revenue stream to look, that long-term revenue stream to look like a short-term economic revenue stream, and to play fairly against your distribution/wholesale load management function. And that's a like levelization, on top of sort of variability, and it's a challenge anyway. I'll leave it at that now.
There's just one other area I wanted to explore. This has been going on forever. Distributed resources, distributed generations. Back in the 80s when I was working on it, was cogeneration. And the barrier always turned out to be the two charges that utilities impose. One, backup rates, what it costs for you to interconnect and not have to build a completely redundant system. And two, interconnection costs. Does that go away in any way, in anybody's future? Or are we still going to need, if the distributed generation unit interconnects with the utility and is reliant on the utility for when they're down to get power, there's going to be a need for some rate, and there's going to be a need, if they're going to interconnect, for them to pay for the interconnection. How do we, and I'd be interested from Solar City's perspective, how do we get that right?
Well, so first off, I think that for small distributed generators, the physical interconnection costs are negligible to none.
And are the charges negligible at this point?
No.
Okay.
But like there's duplicate meter infrastructure that gets put in that one could argue is unnecessary. But for small distributed generators, the actual interconnection costs can be made effectively zero. Now, in terms of, and I'm going to repeat what I was saying before, in terms of kind of covering standby charges as well as nighttime usage, and that is that it's important that the participant is always paying something, okay, and that they are always covering their cost to serve. So and I think we have that now, and that's a model that can work for the future.
Yeah, I mean I agree with that. I think we really need to understand that. In terms of interconnection, there are costs. They could be very minimal for some small local DG, but in aggregate, right, if everybody is small on the same circuit, they may not be. So we need to really consider what those costs are and understand just what's happening in the system. Certainly larger units could have more significant costs, and we certainly want to make sure, particularly with the network system, but we have to make sure we have the right infrastructure in place, and part of the cost may be ultimately the communications equipment that's necessary to be able to have the visibility into what's happening. In terms of standby rates, if folks are still going to want to rely on the system, we need to understand the cost of providing that and of reserving that system. And what happens if on the peak hot day someone has a DG and their system fails and they want to rely on the network, unless they're agreeing to not take that service.
But sometimes those charges were based on individuals, and there weren't the
So-
probability of a cumulative 77 of them going down at exactly the same
So so we don't have that experience. So I agree with you that as we get experience and there's more of a portfolio of resources, we need to consider that.
So is
in
there,
the rate
is there a
design.
way then, to price this in such a way to incent more resources rather than making everyone, as we used to do, pay full-on costs so that we get that signal and we know how many distributed resources we can do to reduce those network charges?
I think we could start considering, what a portfolio might look like and what those costs might be, and then understand as we do that, what does that mean in terms of where the costs fall? And so I think that's a valuable discussion to have as we move forward.
And I'd agree that I certainly don't have the answer today, but as far as the standby charges and so forth, I think it's a very rich area to look at, both for the portfolio aspect as well as just even on a customer-by-customer basis. How are they built up, or the ways we've traditionally looked at it, are they still appropriate? And as we go forward, it seems to me that whether it's a microgrid or a single installation or what have you, exactly what extent of service they're relying on the utility to provide as a standby also could become a factor and a variable that needs to be thought about.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I'm glad to hear Stuart agree that it might be time to reconsider standby rates. If that's what
I
heard.
said, let me clarify.
You said, let it be wrote.
And I can tell you, I haven't been involved in that case. The standby rates ignore the diversity of the resources, but it also ignores the reliability value. We're now talking about a system in which the utility relies on the distributed resource for reliability. So maybe there's a reliability benefit that ought to be counted in the standby rates.
Yeah, I'll add on top of that. I think everybody understands that standby rates are kind of a kludgy way to sort of accommodate the situation of a customer who's largely self-generating but occasionally needs the grid, and stay within the confines of sort of our old-fashioned sort of rate structure. I think it begs the question, two big questions that are going to have to accompany this process and that we'll have to deal with in rates is, number one, multi-part rates. We're just going to have to deal with the flows and the direction of the flows in order to address those things, network functions and support versus customers doing export, for example. And we're going to have to do some segmentation. Contrary to the mood around the country to try to make bigger and bigger groups out of small customer classes, I think we're going to have to understand that different kinds of customers with different kinds of compositions of technologies have different kinds of costs and potential benefits on the grid. And that's what those multi-part rates can take advantage of and appropriately price. So it's, it's going to come down the line. We're not going to be able to average everybody. We'll need a default level of service, and then we'll need the people who are doing more.
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in. I think given the REV's kind of reliance on distributed generation as one of the primary DERs, I think it's incumbent that we address the standby rates sooner rather than later. As John mentioned, the current rates do not reflect any of the diversity and just assumes that every DG unit is going to go out at the same time, in the afternoon of the hottest day, and we just know that's not going to happen. But the rates are actually based on that. It doesn't recognize any of the reliability or other benefits. The current policy is based on a revenue neutrality principle where we can't, no one can suffer a loss of revenues by a customer installing DG. I think it's time to re-examine that. And I don't want to debate kind of the fundamental issues, but I think when the Commission seeks comments and they receive 50 some odd comments from people all over the spectrum identifying standby rates and interconnection costs as the two big impediments, I think you're hearing a message that's loud and clear. And in terms of the interconnection, I think it's really a two-part concern. One is the interconnection costs for doing it, but also it's a very time-consuming process that sometimes, it's not a simple hookup. I understand what Stu is saying. Sometimes for a larger DG unit, it takes design work. It's not an easy hookup, but that doesn't mean it should take forever either to find out what it's going to cost. And so, if we want DER or distributed generation to get off the ground and really contribute. And I'd like to see the prices right, the proper price signals, and without again, I'll use the word again, overly subsidizing DG, because there are a lot of customers who can't install DG. We don't want to impose on them by giving, a subsidy here. But if we can get the price signals right, it could have a big impact. But we really need to start tackling that issue.
Yeah. I'll just pile on. My experience is that most of the benefit or cost curves associated with distributed energy resources of all kinds are not, in fact, straight line functions. Therefore, anytime you try to rely on an average across a broad range of penetration for any technology or any resource, you are inevitably wrong. And that's the path we've been using in other parts of the country, and it will not sustain the animation of a DER market in New York.
So I think I heard everyone say that a standby rate is a feature, but that the design needs to perhaps consider diversity. But I think you have a little bit of a chicken and egg, that we don't have the diversity now. So do we, how do we consider that diversity before we have it, and how do we consider the impact of making a change before we have that diversity on all the other customers that don't participate? So
if I can
I disagree, though?
Before we, I know where you want to go. I just want to make sure I don't run out of time, and I see if other questions that people, or you okay?
Well, I'd like to circle back just for a minute to utility ownership of behind-the-meter DER. I was really intrigued by the conversation that Michael had with the chair about the possibility of the larger C&I customers as opposed to mass market customers being able to contract freely with the utility for that kind of services. And I know this is not a way that would be acceptable to the utility to cut it, but for those of you who are opposed to utility ownership of behind-the-meter DER, do you really have an objection if the larger C&I customers are an exception to that?
I'm not sure. I think this to someone else, so I'll let them answer. But just be clear, it's not. I was okay with the chair's example where a customer contracts with a utility affiliate directly without the utility's involvement, not the utility. Just to be clear. Okay.
And I think we take the same view that we think in a rate-based context, the utility, traditional, in that side of the business unit, we don't think there's really a role for DER ownership there. And, I think while I can respect that hypothetical, I think the cleaner approach for the confidence of the market is to restrict the unregulated affiliates, if they want to get into that business, to areas outside of their own footprint. I think the test there is, or the hypothetical is that, one of Michael's clients, one of the members of his group, goes out and seeks offers from a number of companies, and for some reason the pool of respondents is either so small or in other ways is not sufficient. And there's some supposition that the utility affiliate would be particularly suited somehow to provide a better solution. Our going-in assumption is that if one of his customers goes out, there will be vibrant interest in that. You will get a competitive outcome. You will get a wide range of responses. So we think, again, from a structural point of view, for confidence to ensure that people feel good about the investment opportunities, it makes sense to keep the utility affiliates out of their own footprint. And I don't see a structural need to allow them in, other than this hypothetical, which may or may not occur. But I think there's damage to allowing it, whereas I think there's very little downside to having that kind of a restriction.
Can I mean, obviously, we disagree with that because we think that it's critically important and that we shouldn't act on perceptions before reality of what the issues are. And in terms of utilities being able to own, certainly there's, we have regulators, we can have rules in place. We haven't even addressed tariff design. That's a Track 2 issue. So, to us, why would we foreclose any option at this point before we've had the opportunity to fully to fully vet that, including, utility affiliates in the utility service territory. We have zero market share now. I don't even know that I would foreclose the mass market customers. I think in that regard, that may be an area where utilities can engage customers and help. And that's certainly something that can be reviewed over time, and policies don't have to be set in stone up front. Policies can change and evolve over time, but we really caution against making decisions up front based on perceptions of things that could happen, because we could foreclose the opportunity for customers to really see some of the benefits.
I'm going to return to my default value of disagreeing with Stuart. In the gas retail access markets, we initially utility affiliates were held out of their own service territories, and that rule was eventually reversed with no bad effects. And this is a different case, though. This is a case where the incumbent utility would be actually potentially dispatching the actual affiliate's resource. And we think that's just an unacceptable conflict of interest. And a few minutes ago, when we were talking about the possibility of the Commission's authority to ensure fair use of the distribution system, everybody laughed when we talked about the possibility of maybe a prudence investigation. But Stuart just said, well, there's utility rules that will, or Commission rules that will prevent us from exercising market power with regard to dispatching his own resources. Well, we just don't think that's credible.
If I could just add one other point, I think there is real danger in, asking the utilities to sort of take that lead role and have that ownership, because I think it fundamentally changes the perception of those third-party investors. Is there a real opportunity here, or is the table tilted somehow? And I think especially in the early phases, to animate, to use the term that's out there, the market, and to bring those outside parties, I think it's critically important that it be clear that that's a place for those third-party independent parties to go and innovate and make something happen, as opposed to having to worry about, fight through, get past the incumbents in that role.
So I'd like to say that there are other participation models which Soul City has kind of collaborated with. So there are ways for utilities to co-own distributed resources, and this has been incredibly successful for PG&E, whose unregulated division co-owned distributed rooftop systems with Soul City, and actually earned a great rate of return. So there is this ability for the co-ownership, rather than this idea of it has to be absolutely owned by the utility.
And I just want to say, when we say utility ownership, utilities typically work with third parties and vendors and would work to innovate and create new business models. So I think there's a lot under the hood, and I think just an immediate decision of say no before there's a full investigation of what the options could be, as was just said by Solar City, I think would be probably to the disadvantage of customers that may benefit from some of those business models.
I just think, Michael, I'm not agreeing with you or disagreeing with you, but I do think the standby rates is something that we could have a longer discussion on, and it is something that I think people hear loud and clearly. I do think that some of the Track 2 issues may need to be fleshed out a little bit in the Track 1, not necessarily to bump them up to Track 1, but to resolve some of the forecasting that may be needed to make some determinations. Frankly, and I don't want to steal the thunder of the panel 3, but frankly, I kind of see the threshold issue as a customer data access as a key to promoting the whole market for DER. So from my perspective, I just kind of want to know what the best strategy is for creating the access to the data that allows the DER providers to cater to the customer needs. And I'm sort of the opinion that if you solve that issue and you assure appropriate utility incentives that have to also ensure that it's done timely and securely, that then you do get through a lot of the battle, and then you can come back and sort of evaluate how it's going. But when I look at that, I see there's a lot of threshold issues with the customer data access, and I just wonder if anyone has any comment on that.
No, it's a great question. I particularly love it because I preferred this panel, but I do have an interest in that issue on panel 3. I can answer you on behalf of the large customers, and probably it's a very valid question, and my answer is probably going to provide very little help to you, because my answer is from the perspective of...
I found that about you.
Okay. I'm glad. I'll be consistent. On behalf of large industrial, commercial, institutional energy consumers, energy consumption pricing data is extremely confidential and proprietary. They have significant concerns about the release or public dissemination of that data to third parties. At least for large customers, I don't want to speak for a mass market or other customers because it's maybe a completely different answer and analysis. But for the large customers, we don't have a problem accessing our information in terms of our consumption, our pricing. We don't have any problem working with the utility on that data. We don't have any problems with getting the release of that data to third parties that we want to have it. But we have significant concerns about our individual consumption and pricing data being put out onto some public exchange where any party can have access to it. And so we'd prefer it not to happen. We'd prefer any type of release of information to be on an opt-in rather than an opt-out basis. And if it is on an opt-out basis, I would predict that multiple interveners members would almost uniformly opt out.
Thank you.
Sorry, so Soul City, by the way, speaks to about 100,000 people per month and talks to them about the current energy usage. And trying to get an appreciation for how much they're using is actually incredibly difficult given this kind of the state of the internet today. If there was a simple process where the customer could, through email with one click after authenticating, release the information after their approval, that would be spectacular. This is not a difficult technological problem by any means. People in California have tried. They've tried a green button format, but the user experience is that I have to go to a website, log on, find a specific page, download a CSV file, then attach that CSV file, and then email it. So that is state of the art right now. Like if there was some way to very easily go, you're a trusted, certified distributed resource provider, and you're asking me for my energy usage. I approve you to get my energy usage, and for that transaction to happen in a matter of seconds would be amazing.
I love that song.
Yeah. I'll just say a couple of things out there. First of all, I understand the issue of competitive concerns at the large customer level. I think the individual customer level is going to be really hard to serve. It's aggregation that we care about. So what we really need is sort of marginal distribution capacity cost at the subnodal level revealed for people to play an aggregation play against. One other alternative is I don't know why we couldn't have competition for meter service. I mean, in the old days of DREG, we acted like the meter was the last frontier, but with the modern technology, competition in meter service would automatically put that out there. We toyed with this at Austin Energy. We were setting it up just when I left, but another way to do it is an enterprise bus in the cloud. Require the DSP to put an enterprise bus in the cloud against which you could have firewall protection, but in which prices were revealed for customers to connect with. Then go buy your cloud enterprise-enabled DER apparatus like a Nest thermostat, and you can immediately participate through your cloud interface. So I think there's some options there that don't require every single person or business divulging their energy consumption. We can still get at some of those markets.
Can I just say that I just want to jump in just in terms of meters. I think there's experience, particularly in the UK, where the utilities did not own the meters and things didn't work out so well. And so I think that it's important. I think the meter usage is important. I think we need to really consider AMI and the role that plays to get detailed usage for all customers. I think we need to be able to provide information, but I think we have to distinguish information from data. And so when do we provide data? When do we provide information? I keep getting in my head, I get a credit card bill every month. It has details of everything I buy. I don't want them to give anybody the detailed information of what's on my credit card bill, but I know the bank provides information about me and others to other entities because I get offers for things in the mail all the time. So there is a distinction between what types of information that can be shared versus detailed data, and we need to really understand that.
Because we do have a panel on this, let me ask Commissioner Akinporter, do you have any question?
I think I want to get back to the DSP identity, and Raj, you really haven't had anything to say, and I hate when that happens.
How much time do I have, Kate?
Put on red.
Some of the panelists were pretty upfront about disagreement with the identity. And so I'd like you to get into, because we know that the Commission, our favorite word is usually flexibility. But after you say what you have to say, I'd like to hear from those who disagree, and I'd like to have some input as to how they feel they can better maneuver with the choice of the straw proposal.
Thank you, Pat. The staff straw proposal described staff's initial view as to who should be the distribution system platform provider. It recognized the arguments that it should be an independent entity, something like the ISO perhaps, where they do not own the underlying assets. But then it went on to say there are certain benefits, at least in the near term, for the incumbent utility to be the distribution system platform provider, given the planning role that they have, given the investment role that they have to meet reliability obligations. But perhaps do not take that as a given forever. This is an immediate interim step where the incumbent utility would be the DSP, but over time we should reassess and see if that responsibility could be shifted to an independent entity. And one of the major concerns is if the DSP also owns the DER assets. Clearly there are bigger concerns for many of the folks here. But if the DSP, the incumbent utility, does not own the underlying DERs, do you still see any objections to the incumbent utility being the DSP assets? Okay. Do you see any objection to?
You're
That's
so
an
good.
echo. I get. That's my twin evil brother speaking there. So do you see any still objection to the incumbent utility being the DSP in the near term to get this going if the utility does not own the DER assets?
Yeah, I'll quickly say one of the comments we put in response to the straw proposal was that given that we might need to go to an independent distribution system operator at some point because we can't mitigate market power abuses, we should have a transition plan to the IDSO in hot standby waiting on the shelf. Let's get the plan for that in place. We don't have to use it if everybody behaves, but we won't lose a year constructing the plan if we realize we have to use it. So that's one sort of prophylactic. I agree that some of the benefits that we can get from, I like John Rowe's famous statement of from allowing the rat to smell the cheese are worth pursuing, and the direction we want to move the incumbents towards being a more independent DSP. We shouldn't give up those benefits as part of that process of transition. And if they choose to have it in their business model to make that transition and behave independently, then we ought to facilitate that because of the efficiencies and those benefits like Raj mentioned. In terms of ownership, maybe again, this is one of those places where separating the revenue streams is appropriate, and picking up on Commissioner Brown's thing. If we can't get them, if the market is not capable or not interested in responding to a need, and we could satisfy the need by them participating in a distributed energy resources solution that we encourage them to participate in, then that seems like the kind of stream that we want to have as that sort of default or last resort solution. And then we maybe even get the benefit of their economies of scale in doing so.
We see some real differences between the DSP and the ISO, and that leads us to believe that, again, at least initially, that the incumbent utilities probably should be the DSP. The ISO is one entity that operates transmission facilities owned by, I think now it's 4 companies. The coordination problem among those 4 companies is essentially solved by the ISO. The DSP doesn't have that coordination problem. So the way it comes down is the physical realities of it and the overall difficulties with all the other problems we're dealing with. We think, for the initially at least, the utility is the logical DSP.
On this issue, multiple interveners agreed with the staff recommendation for the reasons in the straw proposal.
And I think, we're certainly comfortable, or we start from the premise that this, the DSP should be independent of market outcomes, ownership and financial interests and so forth. But harking back to sort of where I started today, we're concerned about creating a lot of overhead and infrastructure that may ultimately have limited value and use. So we think that with the understandings about ownership of DER and with appropriate safeguards between what the DSP function is versus potentially other utility functions, we think the utility is probably a reasonable place to go for that. And we think that whether it's all lumped together or whether this DSP function is somehow separated and revenues are differently treated within the utility rate recovery model, we think it's worth exploring. How do we get this function to want to be the best facilitator of DER that it can be? How do we incent them to? How do we get the rat to smell the cheese? To put out the appropriate information, put out the appropriate tariff information, shorten up and minimize the interconnection process, reform the standby charges, all those kind of things that will facilitate the third parties and customers. How do we get them to want to do that?
We support the straw proposal on the DSP, but we don't think it's contingent on the DER position, and not to beat a dead horse, but I think that we need to really consider the DER ownership issue and the potential business models for utilities and with utilities and third parties, and we ought to consider that model as well.
So, I would just say that I think that there's a whole bunch of things that third parties and companies who are motivated to innovate could do better. I think interconnection is one. I think metering is another. And then also in a market for distributed resources, I think there may be some inherent bias on the part of the utility to select certain types of resources, especially if the revenues are going to be coupled to the cost of those resources. And so for that reason, do I think that an independent system operator may be better.
Okay. Can I just follow up? I think, at least on an interim basis, with these caveats that you have provided, there seems to be semi-consensus that incumbent utility could be could be the DSP. Let me just move on to DER ownership of assets of the incumbent utility. Today, the utilities are providing energy efficiency services. Do any of you see them stop doing that, or could they continue to do, or in fact enlarge the portfolio of energy? The DER is, to me, 3 buckets: energy efficiency, demand load management, demand response, dynamic load management, and the third is physical assets like solar and other distributed generation resources. For the energy efficiency component, can they continue to do what they're doing and go beyond that, or?
I'll say, I think there's, going all the way back to the start, the fact that we still expect somebody to provide that provider of last resort function, and having, my experience in running utility energy efficiency programs is that the market is not quite ready to provide cost-effective, what are cost-effective energy efficiency services to some low-income and hard-to-reach classes. So I think there is a role there for that that entity at the distribution level to go after those very valuable resources, but under more of a regulated construct. And I think it's going to be with us for a little while.
I guess from multiple interveners' standpoint, we think that many forms of energy efficiency are extremely cost effective, and our members have been doing it for years and years because it makes business sense to do so, and it's the right thing to do. Where we struggle with is the continuing subsidization of energy efficiency. And I'd like to see us transition to something that is more market-based, where, you know, similar to solar now, and where there's an end date where there are ESCOs and other parties who are actively in the DER market and trying to create, programs and projects and solutions for customers to consider that the customers pay for themselves because it's economic and it makes sense for them to do so, rather than having non-participating customers bear the lion's share of those costs.
Go back to the old debate about benefits and burdens.
We think it's important to maintain energy efficiency programs, at least during the transition to the new world, the REV world. There's a small ecosystem of contractors and companies that are doing energy efficiency as contractors to either to utilities or to NYSERDA. We think all those things should continue. Let them run their course. At some point, we may or may not get to a point where the market price signals generate a spontaneous market in that, and that'll be fine. But we should not do anything to undermine what is actually going ahead now, and which we think is providing benefits.
But if just on that point, though, because listening to what Michael said and what you just said, John, if we were to send a market price signal, and to the extent we can meet that need with market response, your view would be we just do simultaneously, we just don't let go of one before we know the other's working?
Yeah, that's right. We think we're quite a ways
and there may be
from a market system.
Right. And there may be pockets, as Carl said, like low income or mass market, where that might take longer to evolve than in other markets.
Well, and the traditional industrial sort of 1-year payback requirement for resources that operate and, you know, once installed for decades to save energy is not necessarily appropriate. I mean, we have to move to some sort of value-based assessment of it as opposed to a short-run marginal cost view. There's another economic stream for energy efficiency besides short-run marginal costs.
Let me move on to the second bucket. Some of the utilities do have demand response dynamic load management tariffs in place, and some others are actually planning to incorporate additional ones. And the utilities may have, incumbent utilities may have an opportunity to control loads directly from their operating room to make sure they can count on these resources and pay accordingly. Do any of you oppose utilities continuing to provide demand response dynamic load management tariffs, or perhaps enhanced tariffs?
I think in this area we're more interested in going back to the principle, and to some extent this applies to the efficiency as well, but I think it just may be more prevalent here, of where there is an opportunity for a competitive supply of that and competitive identification of the value, that's probably the better way to go. So, you know, to the extent that those programs and cutting back on a customer's usage are driven by the customer's ability to avoid either high energy charges or allocation of capacity or other charges, we think there's probably room there to create that customer valuation, and it need not necessarily come from the utility or the DSP or what have you. To the extent that there are programs that stay in place, through the utility or the DSP, to your last point as far as control, we're also interested in exploring how the customer directly or the third-party provider can provide that control service in response, again, to price or other signals from the system.
Yeah. I'll say my personal experience is that What most utility incumbents do not do is flow back the benefits from demand response through the accounting and financial channels so that it gets treated as anything but a cost center. So sort of, like I said earlier on, it's sort of, we assume demand, we built supply to fit, and then they made us do some other stuff, so we just treat that as a cost. When demand response works well, it then saves money on that wholesale, and that credit should flow back to that cost center to start showing that it could be a profitable business. When that gets revealed, then doing it within the utility will suddenly become attractive to others, and that's exactly what's happened with emergency interruptible load, load acting as resource, and other innovations in ISOs.
So if I could just follow that question. I mean, because is part of the challenge that we're talking about, though, is that individual loads may have, let's say, a value of 1, but two loads in combination may have a value of 4. And if we're trying to get to the value of 4, there's got to be some entity who can match those loads together. And if it's not the ISO, because they're no longer looking at DR, who is the natural aggregator?
DSP is the load manager.
Yeah. I would agree. I think there is a function for the DSP. I'd like to see programs where customers can participate directly and also through aggregators, because I think there is a role for aggregators. But I agree that the compensation and the rules have to make sense. We have to make it beneficial to participate, but also beneficial to the non-participants as well, where it's not being subsidized. And so the details are really important. But generally speaking, I think there is a role for the utilities in administering retail demand response.
Okay, so 2 out of the 3 buckets.
Raj, I'm going to have to. We are way beyond
last
our
question.
Time.
Maybe.
Okay.
So the 2 out of the 3 buckets, I think there's a comfort that the incumbent utility can continue to play a role, which is useful. So the only one where I think folks are having some discomfort is the utilities actually owning distributed generation type assets. Is there any scenario in your mind as a backstop solution or some other reason they should be allowed to own, or do you see they should be completely out of the DG business? Not for Stu, for the others.
I would not categorically preclude them. I think there are circumstances in which it is the right thing to do on behalf of the cost and load management obligations.
And I guess it's sort of a natural thing for me. Never say never, but I'm struggling to come up with a scenario where in response to some reliability need or something that a utility has identified, that no one would step forward. I have trouble envisioning that. So I just don't see a need to explicitly and affirmatively put the utilities in that role.
Yeah, that's about where I am, too. I just don't see the need for it.
I agree.
Can I just clarify one thing, Raj? I think we're talking mostly about the behind-the-meter DER. There are distributed assets that will be connected to the distribution grid that could be very valuable and helpful in managing the grid.
Wow. Thank you. And thank you to the audience for your patience. But a lot to pursue, but good. Thank you for the conversation.
15-minute break.
Well done, gentlemen.
So, Kate, when do we need to come back?
We're going to take a short 10-minute break now.
Oh, really?
On the
That's
next
it?
panel.